Imagine waking up one morning to discover that nuclear missiles capable of destroying your entire city were sitting just 90 miles from your home. There were no warning sirens, no emergency broadcasts, and no signs of panic. Children still went to school, businesses opened as usual, and families continued their daily routines. Yet behind the closed doors of the White House, President John F. Kennedy was preparing for a decision that could determine whether humanity would survive. For 13 days in October 1962, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. One mistake, one misunderstood order, or one frightened soldier could have triggered a conflict that might have killed hundreds of millions of people. Historians still describe these 13 days as the closest humanity has ever come to destroying itself. To understand how this terrifying crisis began, we need to go back to the end of World War II. When the war ended in 1945, two nations emerged as global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Although they had fought together against Nazi Germany, they quickly became rivals. The United States promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union sought to spread communism around the world. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. It wasn't fought through direct battles between American and Soviet armies. Instead, both sides competed through espionage, military alliances, political influence, and an ever-growing nuclear arms race. By the late 1950s, both countries possessed thousands of nuclear weapons. Military experts understood a frightening reality. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would strike back immediately. The result would be total devastation on both sides. Meanwhile, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, another story was unfolding. In 1959, a young revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's government. At first, many believed he would build a democratic nation. Instead, Castro aligned himself with the Soviet Union and embraced communism. For the United States, this was alarming. Never before had a communist government existed so close to American territory. President Kennedy's administration feared that Cuba could become a permanent Soviet military base in the Caribbean. In April 1961, the United States secretly supported an invasion by Cuban exiles, hoping to overthrow Castro. The operation, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, ended in complete failure. Castro's forces defeated the invaders within days. The failed invasion convinced Castro that another American attack was only a matter of time. He turned to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev for protection. Khrushchev saw an opportunity. The United States had already placed nuclear missiles in Turkey within striking distance of Soviet cities. Placing Soviet missiles in Cuba would balance the military advantage while protecting Castro's government. In complete secrecy, Soviet cargo ships began sailing toward Cuba. Officially, they carried tractors, industrial machinery, and construction equipment. In reality, hidden beneath the cargo were nuclear missiles, launch vehicles, radar systems, and thousands of Soviet soldiers. Construction crews worked mostly at night. Missile launch sites were hidden beneath camouflage nets. Soviet commanders believed the operation would remain secret until every missile was ready. For weeks, everything went according to plan. Then came October 14, 1962. An American U-2 spy plane flew over western Cuba on a routine reconnaissance mission. The photographs it captured would change history forever. When intelligence analysts examined the images, they immediately recognized missile launch sites under construction, long cylindrical missiles, fuel storage tanks, launch pads, support vehicles. There was no doubt the Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles inside Cuba. The photographs were rushed directly to the White House. President Kennedy stared silently at the evidence. If those missiles became operational, Washington, New York, Miami, Chicago, and dozens of other American cities could be destroyed within minutes. Kennedy immediately gathered his closest advisors into a secret emergency committee known as ExComm. Inside the White House, intense debates began. Some generals demanded immediate airstrikes against every missile base. Others argued for a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Diplomats warned that killing Soviet soldiers would almost certainly provoke Moscow, and if the Soviet Union retaliated, the world could fall into nuclear war. For nearly a week, the meetings continued in complete secrecy. Maps covered the conference tables. Military officers updated the president every hour. Every passing day allowed Soviet engineers to move closer to completing the missile sites. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans had no idea what was happening. Schools remained open, television programs continued as usual, families planned birthdays, weddings, and vacations. They had no idea that the world was standing on the edge of catastrophe. Finally, Kennedy made his decision. Instead of launching an invasion, he ordered a naval blockade, officially called a quarantine. American warships surrounded Cuba with one clear mission: no Soviet ship carrying military equipment would be allowed to pass. Within hours, destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, and fighter aircraft moved into position. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Soviet cargo ships continued sailing toward Cuba. Soon, the two greatest military powers on Earth would face each other directly. The entire world waited in fear. Would the Soviet ships stop, or would the first shots of World War III be fired in the Caribbean Sea? As American warships formed a defensive line around Cuba, the world held its breath. Every radar station, every military base, and every intelligence agency watched the same question unfold. Would the Soviet ships continue forward? If they did, the U.S. Navy had orders to stop them. A single warning shot or a misunderstanding could trigger a chain of events no one would be able to control. On October 24, 1962, the moment finally arrived. Several Soviet cargo ships approached the American quarantine line. Tension inside the White House reached its highest point. Military commanders prepared for the possibility of armed confrontation. Then something unexpected happened. Just before reaching the American blockade, many Soviet ships slowed down. Some turned around, others stopped and waited for new instructions from Moscow. For the moment, a direct military clash had been avoided, but the crisis was far from over. The nuclear missiles already inside Cuba were still there, and Soviet engineers continued working to make them fully operational. Each passing hour increased the danger. Then came the most terrifying day of the entire crisis, October 27, 1962. Today, historians remember it as Black Saturday. That morning, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Rudolf Anderson, was killed instantly. News of his death reached Washington within minutes.
Many American military leaders believed the United States had no choice but to respond with immediate airstrikes. At almost the same time, another dangerous event was unfolding deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean. A Soviet submarine named B-59 had been hiding underwater for days. The crew had lost communication with Moscow. They had no idea whether war had already begun. American destroyers, trying to force the submarine to surface, dropped small practice depth charges. Although these explosives were not intended to destroy the submarine, the exhausted Soviet crew didn't know that. Inside the submarine, temperatures exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The air was running out. The crew believed they might already be under attack. The submarine carried a nuclear torpedo powerful enough to destroy an entire naval fleet. Its captain considered launching it. Under Soviet rules, 3 senior officers had to agree before firing the nuclear weapon. 2 officers voted yes. Only 1 man refused. His name was Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov argued that they should surface first and wait for confirmation instead of starting a nuclear war. After a tense argument, the captain accepted his advice. The submarine surfaced peacefully. Years later, historians concluded that Arkhipov's decision may have saved millions of lives. Back in Washington, President Kennedy was searching desperately for a peaceful solution. Then 2 messages arrived from Soviet leader Khrushchev. The first message sounded emotional and personal. He offered to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promised never to invade the island. A few hours later, a second message arrived. This one demanded something more. The Soviet Union wanted the United States to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. Kennedy faced another impossible decision. Publicly accepting the demand might make America appear weak. Rejecting it could lead to war. Finally, Kennedy chose a clever strategy. He publicly accepted the first proposal, promising not to invade Cuba. At the same time, through secret diplomatic channels, he privately agreed that American missiles in Turkey would later be removed. The negotiations remained completely confidential. On October 28, 1962, the world finally received the news everyone had been hoping for. Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle and withdraw its nuclear missiles from Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over. American forces gradually lowered their alert level. Soviet ships began returning home. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, humanity could breathe again. But the crisis left a permanent mark in history. Both superpowers realized how close they had come to total destruction. To reduce the risk of future misunderstandings, the United States and the Soviet Union established a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow. It became known as the Hotline. Future arms control agreements followed, helping slow the nuclear arms race. The Cuban Missile Crisis also changed how world leaders viewed nuclear weapons. Victory in a nuclear war was impossible. Even the strongest nation could lose everything. Perhaps the greatest lesson came from ordinary people whose names were almost forgotten by history. A careful intelligence analyst who correctly identified missile sites. Diplomats who continued talking when others demanded war, and one submarine officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who refused to approve the launch of a nuclear torpedo. Their decisions remind us that history is not always shaped by the loudest voices or the biggest armies. Sometimes it is shaped by a single person choosing patience over panic. More than 60 years later, the Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most important warnings in human history. It reminds us that peace is often protected not by weapons, but by communication, restraint, and the courage to step back when the world stands on the edge of disaster. Because in October 1962, humanity came closer to the end than most people ever realized. And the fact that we're here today is one of history's greatest miracles.